Hello everyone, I'm Sugary Sweet, and you are watching Battle 9 of my Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 Insane Mode Efficiency playthrough. The team has finally found their way onto a train that will take them back to the Republic. And before we got onto the train, we actually got a new recruit into our ranks. And there was actually a weapon shop amongst the passengers, so we got some new weapons as well. But before that, I need to immediately start talking about what I'm doing on this map. The first thing I did was to have Albright attack this barrel, so that I can open up the road for Synbios to move later in the turn. I also moved Julian into a position where he is going to be able to bait in an enemy that is way on the other side of the cart. The setup on this first turn is actually kind of important because I need to get into a specific position so that I can try to get all the enemies into a position that is favorable to clearing this map quickly. A couple people are going to stay near the beginning of the map or respawn so they can take care of the enemies that are near there, so including Dantares and our new recruit, Cybel. Most of the enemies there are wielding swords, so they have weapon triangle advantage against them, and that will be very helpful. So once we get around to Synbios' turn, we're going to see him make basically this kind of suicidal charge into the enemy ranks. And he immediately triggers just this event cutscene that happens in the middle of the map. So obviously this is just a bunch of bandits that attack the train, and we're trying to fight against them. And they're uncoupling the cars basically just to spook the team and just be like, haha, we're gonna go get the civilians. But as far as I know, it doesn't actually affect anything in the map itself. So right now on the left side of the map, you might see that I'm going to get a fair number of critical hits, and even though it just seems like I'm getting really lucky in this take, it's worth remembering that since I am at weapon triangle advantage, I also could have gotten a bunch of counters since for some reason the sword-wielding enemies decide to attack all my lance-wielding characters. So the odds of me getting either criticals or counters to finish them off faster is pretty good. And in a few moments you're actually going to get to see Hayward join in on the fun as well. So I've actually given the Gale Ring over to Hayward, and you're going to see some of the shenanigans that I had mentioned before, starting now. I mentioned this when we obtained it, but the Gale Ring does give +5 agility to whoever has it equipped. So those of you who thought about it a little bit more probably immediately spotted one of the fun things that you can do with agility boosting items in this sense. Hayward started with his loincloth already equipped, and he has a Gale Ring in his inventory, and what he's going to do is that he is going to equip the Gale Ring and then attack. So this means he moves very late in one turn and then moves very early in the next turn. And what this means is that you can move after enemy units on one turn and then move before them on the next turn, which in a sense gives you 2 turns in a row. Now obviously this isn't a literal thing, you don't actually get 2 turns in a row. Every unit still only has 1 move per turn, but obviously it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of responding to enemy movements. So like in this case, if I had Hayward equipped with the Gale Ring at the very beginning of the map, he would have moved first and then nothing would have been in his range. But instead what I can do now is have him act near the end of the turn when enemies have already closed in, and then he can act early next turn to also clear the road and let Julian move forward. And of course, with these birdmen being flyers, Hayward does, alongside his weapon triangle advantage, he has the loincloth equipped on the second attack he does here, so he has a total of 20 base crit plus 20% from weapon triangle advantage and plus 12% from loincloth for a total of about 52%. So meanwhile, you can see that Synbios is kinda in a lot of trouble here, he's nearing death. That mage is giving him a hard time, and he's going to have some trouble hitting him, and throwing a dagger really isn't going to do much damage either. So of course the best solution here is to have Mascarin come in and try to blaze them down at some point. Problem is that we only have 1 space behind Synbios, so if Mascarin takes up that space, then normally if we only had heal 1, it wouldn't be adequate to be healing up Synbios. But thankfully we just happened to learn heal 2 in the last map after saving all those refugees. So Grace is able to stay 1 space away and still heal Synbios back up. Though for this first particular turn, what we're going to do is have Mascarin actually blaze the dwarf and then have Synbios finish it off. Because the swarms of birdmen are not a threat to Synbios at all, their attack just isn't very high, but the dwarf has really high attack and he is going to be able to finish off Synbios if we left him alive. And of course, another thing that really saves Synbios here is the fact that he's still wearing the life ring, which of course, in addition to the defense that it gives him, it restores 2 HP per turn, which if he didn't have that, he would have died. Now the reason that Synbios is able to take so much punishment on this map is because in the previous exploration section on the train, Synbios was allowed to run around the train a bit, and he found a bottle of milk and he just downed it. Because I guess the logic is that this game was made back when people still believed that milk made your bones healthier. Whatever the case, thanks to that, Synbios is able to simplify his map a lot by just taking on all those enemies at once, instead of us having to inch forward slowly. Now in a few moments, the Dark Mage is going to cast Blaze 2 again, and this time he's going to hit Mascarin as well. And that actually puts her in a little bit of danger because the birdman can fly over the boxes and just go attack her. But Albright's going to come in and plug up the last tile next to her so that none of the enemies can reach her. So on a note related to clearing the map faster, we actually went on a huge shopping spree right before we entered this map. because not only was there, as I mentioned, a bunch of new weapons for us to buy, but it's also the fact that after Battle 9, you're immediately placed into Battle 10, so you cannot restock in between it, and there actually will not be a shop available to you for another 2 battles after that. So Battle 11 and Battle 12, there also isn't going to be a shop in between any of these battles, so we actually bought a ton of medical herbs and put them in the storage. As far as new weapons goes, there were upgrades for Synbios, Dantaras, and Hayward. So Synbios could upgrade to the broadsword, Dantaras could upgrade to the iron lance, and Hayward could upgrade to the short bow. And the big attack increase from that is part of why you saw some of the crazier stuff like Hayward being able to one-shot that Birdman. This is probably a good time to mention that weapon upgrades in this game kind of come staggered in the game, if that makes sense. There are times when characters are going to go for several maps without any upgrades, which normally wouldn't be a huge deal, but sometimes it leads to situations where characters get a really bad lull in their performance. I think the intent by the developers was to make it so that certain characters would have been better for certain maps just based off the fact that weapon upgrades are staggered to you in this way, but it can lead to a situation where certain characters are just not very good for several chapters and then all of a sudden they're just really good again. For example, right now, Albright hasn't had a weapon upgrade in quite a while, so right now when compared to Dantaras, Synbios, or Hayward, he pales pretty heavily in comparison. So not a whole lot else happened during the exploration phase. We did find a bag of chicken feed, which caused a chicken to join the party, but unfortunately the chicken cannot participate in battle, so for now it doesn't really do anything. So I guess that brings us to our new recruit, who is Cybele. She joined us at the tail end of the last map. She actually used to be a soldier working under General Varlant, so basically she's just trying to regain her honor as a knight or whatever. So as you can see, she's a Centaur Knight, just like Dantaras is. So she is going to be just as useful as Dantaras is in the sense that she also has 7 move, and she's going to be the last 7 move unit we're going to get for a really long time. So it's usually not too hard for us to find something for her to do, even if we end up not really training her combat. Although on that note, her combat is usually just fine. Her stats really are barely any different from Dantaras'. The only real difference is that occasionally Cybele will have slightly less HP and maybe a little bit more attack and defense. But the differences are usually so small they just do not matter. But of course we've already invested a lot into Dantaras. You know, we gave him the health bread at the beginning of the game, and he has all kinds of support friendships with other units. So normally Cybele would be a very good unit, but in Insane mode it can be kind of hard to find places for us to train certain units. And I mentioned just a minute ago that certain units will have a lull in performance in certain parts of the game, and that is actually coming up kind of soon for Dantaras as well. There's going to be a section of the game where Dantaras' combat is just really pally in comparison to some other units, and obviously that is going to apply to Cybele even more. But like I said, the 7 move alone is going to give Cybele some usage, and certainly into the late game she's going to be very useful as well. So we are just about ready to clean up the rest of the enemies on the far side of the train car. We're going to have Mascarin take out both the Dark Mage and the Birdman with the Blaze 2, and all there's going to be left are these assassins. As you saw earlier, one of the assassins was fighting near the beginning too, and he was hitting Dantaras really hard. And you might have noticed that Dantaras had to take a couple turns where he just used the Protect Ring to heal himself instead of attacking, which would have been way more useful. One of the issues is that they can sometimes activate their poison attack. This poison is actually different from the one we met earlier in the game from the bats. There's actually 2 levels of poison in this game, and one does 15%, whereas the other one does 30% of your life per turn. The assassins have the 30% damage variant, so that's why you saw the poison doing actually a lot of damage. So because of the extra time we had to spend kind of keeping Dantaras alive near the beginning, they're actually going to kill the final dwarf enemy a little bit later than the rest of the team is able to clear out the other side of the car. But that's not too bad since that gives us a little bit of time to blow up all the barrels that are on this side of the map. Now, barrels are actually kind of an interesting, enemy in this game. So for grindy players, the barrels are interesting because they always give a static 5 experience, so if you've gotten to a point where your units are very over-leveled, you can still hit the barrels and get 5 experience, which I guess is kind of nice. But unfortunately, barrels do not respawn, so you can't grind them endlessly, so you have to wait until you're over-leveled and then you can use the barrels to gain that extra bit of experience if you want to. But for this run, perhaps the more interesting thing about barrels is the fact that they give 5 weapon experience. And I don't know if this was an intentional design choice, but as I mentioned before, weapon experience is based on how much percentage of an enemy's HP you take in one attack. So since with barrels you technically are doing 100% of their HP in a single hit, the game gives you the maximum possible amount of weapon experience by hitting them, which is 5 weapon experience. So deciding who gets to kill the barrels is actually also a consideration at times. Now, as far as the items inside these barrels go, there really isn't anything special in them, and it's pretty rare for barrels to contain anything particularly valuable. In this case, there was an angel wing in one of the barrels near the start. You're never going to see me use angel's wings in this playthrough because angel wings have the same effect as casting the Egress spell, and obviously I'm trying to avoid that. And even though they're worth a little bit more than medical herbs and antidote herbs, they're still only worth 40 gold, which means you can sell them for like 30 gold. So it doesn't really make a difference in terms of our planning for our gold usage. The other 2 items you saw me get from the barrels was the healing drop and a fairy powder. The healing drop, obviously, like I said before, it is nice to get them for free when you can. I don't go out of my way to go get them, but they are worth 200 gold, and unlike medical herbs where I just use them whenever I feel like it, the 200 gold from each healing drop can add up over time. And the fairy powder is really just an upgraded antidote. Like it's basically like the antidote level 2 spell, so it can remove some of the status elements that aren't paralyze or poison. Speaking of antidote, you did see me cast that spell on Synbios earlier. Even though I said that antidote is kind of a waste of a cast sometimes, it's mostly just that I wanted to get rid of the poison before I move on to the next map. Poison is basically the only status effect that stays in between maps in this game, and since the poison here from the assassins is the stronger variant of poison, it is worth taking a bit of extra effort to get rid of it, because otherwise it's just kind of annoying. So there's not a whole lot else to say about this map anymore, but I guess one last thing worth noting is that you've probably seen Irene doing a lot of chip damage over the course of the map using her tornado spell. And the tornado spell is pretty much one of the reasons that Irene is actually in some ways better than she is on normal mode. There's going to be times coming up when a lot of our units are still only able to do like 1 damage because enemy defense values are just going to be growing way too fast. And even though Irene's tornado isn't very strong, it is still a pretty nice, consistent bit of damage for her to put out. So as I finish off this map, you're going to see I get a number of critical hits from Julian. This isn't necessary because you're going to see me attack with Irene one time instead of casting Tornado. So obviously if I had casted Tornado instead of doing this normal attack, I wouldn't have needed any of the crits from Julian. So those crits were pretty much just incidental. As I mentioned before, critical hits in this game add a static amount of damage. So if Julian hadn't gotten any of those crits, he would have been doing 3 damage instead of 6. His attack is low enough so that his damage is floored, but of course, Weapon Triangle advantage gives him a static +2 to his damage. So Julian being near the entrance was kind of key to taking this dwarf out in a reasonable amount of time. The other obvious thing is that I had Dantaris poisoned, and that honestly kind of wasted some turns on him healing himself instead of attacking when he could have. So obviously, just from looking at this, you could probably tell that if I had gotten really lucky with the crits and counters, and I had not gotten poisoned, I probably could have saved an extra turn on this map. But the general theme of this playthrough is still for me to try to stick to specific recordings where I don't get insanely lucky. So after this map is over, we actually get another story section before moving on to the next map, where we meet another character who joins our party. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit more about her in the next map, but the only other thing worth noting here is that there actually is another character with her called Zero, who we send off to protect the passengers in the train that got uncoupled. And he is actually going to meet up with Medion, and he becomes a party member in Scenario 2. So it's just another one of those multiple perspectives things between Scenarios 1 and 2. So all that being said, that is Battle 9. It is completed in 6 turns. I'll see you next time.